Section 11 of the Best Short Stories of 1917. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rel. The Best Short Stories of 1917 by Various. The Emperor of Elam by H.G. Dwight. Part 4. Quattor. The festivities in honor of the Shah's coronation took place at Balabala with due solemnity. Among the black tents there was much plucking of plaintive strings. There was more stuffing of mutton and pilau, and after dark many a little rockets, improvised out of gunpowder and baked clay, traced brief arabesques of gold against the black of the underlying gorges. The castle celebrated in the same simple way. The stuffing, to be sure, was more prolonged and recondite, while dancers imported from Disful swayed and snapped their fingers, singing for the pleasure of the father of swords. The eyes of that old man of the mountain remained opaque as ever, save when he rebuked the almoner who sat at meat with him for indecorously quoting the lines of Shadi, when he says, "Such was this delicate crescent of the moon, and fascination of the holy, this form of an angel, and decoration of a peacock, that let them once behold her, and countenance must cease to exist in the constitutions of the chaste." This rebuke might have been called forth by the presence of another guest at the board. Be that as it may, the eyes of the father of swords glimmered perceptibly when they rested on the unannounced visitor for whom he fished out, with his own henna'd fingers, the fattest morsels of mutton and the juiciest sweets. I hasten to add that the newcomer was not the one whose earlier arrival and interview with the father of swords has already been recorded. He was, nevertheless, a personage not unknown to this record, whether as Signor Machin of Brazil, or as the emissary of the Shah of the Shahs of Ferungistan, for not only had he felt impelled to bid good-bye a second time to his friend Adolphe Gans, prince among the merchants of Shustar, he had even postponed his voyage down the Karun long enough to make one more journey overland to Balabala, and he heard there, not without interest, the story of the short visit and the sudden flight of the young Englishman he had accidentally met on the river. As for Matthews, he celebrated the coronation at Disful, in bed, and by the time he had slept off his fag, Balabala and the father of swords and the green chest and the ingenious Machin looked to him more than ever like figures of myth. He was too little of the timber out of which journalists, romancers, or diplomats are made to take them very seriously. The world he lived in, moreover, was too solid to be shaken by any such flimsy device as the one of which he had happened to catch a glimpse. What had been real to him was that he, Guy Matthews, had been suspected of playing a part in storybook intrigues, and had been treated rudely by an old barbarian of whom he expected the proverbial hospitality of the East. His affair had therefore been to show Mr. Scarlet-Beard that if a lure could turn his back, an Englishman could do likewise. He now saw, to be sure, that he himself had not been altogether the pattern of courtesy, but the old man of the mountain had got what was coming to him, and Matthews regretted very little, after all, missing what he had gone to see. For Disful, peering at him through the arches of the bridge, reminded that there was still something to see. It must be said of him, however, that he showed no impatience to see the neighboring ruins of Susa. He was not one, this young man who was out for a bit of a lark, to sentimentalize about antiquity or the charm of the unspoiled. Yet even such young men are capable of finding the rumness of strange towns a passable enough lark, to say nothing of the general unexpectedness of life. And Disful turned out to be quite as unexpected, in its way, as Balabala. Matthews found that out before he had been 3 days in the place, when a sudden roar set all the loose little panes tinkling in Shere Ali Khan's garden windows. Abbas explained that this was merely a cannon shot, announcing the new moon of Ramazan. That loud call of the faith evidently made Disful a rummer place than it normally was. Matthews soon got used to the daily repetitions of the sound, rumbling off at sunset and before dawn into the silence of the plains. But the recurring explosion became for him the voice of the particular rumness of the fanatical old border town, of fierce sun, terrific smells, snapping dogs, and scowling people. When the stranger without the gate crossed his bridge of a morning for a stroll in the town, he felt like a discoverer of some lost desert city. He threaded alleys of blinding light. He explored dim thatched bazaars. He studied tiled doorways in blank mud walls. He investigated quaint watermills by the river, and scarce a soul did he see, unless a stork in its nest on top of a tall bajir, or a naked dervish lying in a scrap of shade, asleep under a lion's skin. It was as if Disful drowsed sullenly in that July blaze, brewing something like a geyser, and burst out with it at the end of the unendurable day. The brew of the night, however, was a different mixture, quite the rummiest compound of its kind Matthews had ever tasted. The bang of the sunset gun instantly brought the deserted city back to life. Lights began to twinkle in tea-houses along the river, among the indigo plantations. Streets filled with ghostly costumes and jostling camels, and everywhere voices would celebrate the happy return of dusk so strangely and piercingly that they made Matthews think of, quote, battles far away, unquote. This was most so when he listened to them, out of sight of unfriendly eyes, from his own garden. Above the extraordinary rumor that drifted to him through the arches of the bridge, he heard the wailing of pipes, raucous blasts of cow horns, the thumping of drums, while dogs barked incessantly, and all night long the caravans of Mesopotamia jingled to and fro. Then the cannon would thunder out its climax, and the city would fall anew under the spell of the sun. The moon of those Arabian Nights was nearing its first quarter, and Matthews was waiting for it to become bright enough for him to fulfill his true duty as a sightseer by riding to the mounds of Susa, when Disful treated Matthews to fresh discoveries as to what an unspoiled town may contain. It contained, Abbas informed him with some mystery after one of his prolonged visits to the bazaar, another Ferengi. This Ferengi's servant, moreover, had given Abbas explicit directions as to the whereabouts of the Ferengi's house, in order that Abbas might give due warning, as is the custom of the country, of a call from Matthews. Whereat Matthews made the surprising announcement that he had not come to Disful to call on Ferengis. The chief charm of Disful for him, as a matter of fact, was that there he felt himself free of the social obligations under which he had lain rather longer than he liked. But if Abbas was able to resign himself to this new proof of the eccentricity of his master, the unknown Ferengi apparently was not. At all events, Matthews soon made another discovery as to the possibilities of Disful. An evening or two later, as he loitered on the bridge, watching a string of loaded camels, a respectable-looking old gentleman in a black abba addressed him in French and dismal, and it appeared that this remarkable Elamite was a Jew who had picked up in Baghdad the idiom of Paris. He went on to describe himself as the agent of a distinguished foreign resident, who, the linguistic old gentleman gave Matthews to understand, languished for sight of the newcomer, and was unable to understand why he had not already been favored with a call. His pain was the deeper because the newcomer had recently enjoyed the hospitality of this distinguished foreign resident on a little yacht on the river. "The unmitigated bounder!" exclaimed Matthews, unable to deliver himself in French of that sentiment, and turning upon the stupefied old gentleman a rude Anglo-Saxon back. "He has cheek enough for anything." He had enough, at any rate, to knock the next afternoon, unannounced, on Matthews's gate, to follow Matthews's servant into the house without waiting to hear whether Matthews would receive him, to present himself at the door of the dim underground serdab, where Matthews lounged in his pyjamas till it should be cool enough to go out, to make Matthews the most ceremonious of bows, and to give that young man a half-amused, half-annoyed consciousness of being put at his ease. The advantage of position, Matthews had good reason to feel, was with himself. He knew more about the bounder than the bounder thought, and it was not he who had knocked at the bounder's gate. Yet the sound of that knock, pealing muffled through the hot silence, had been distinctly welcome. Nor could our incipient connoisseur of rum towns pretend that the sight of Maheen bowing in the doorway was wholly unwelcome. So long had he been stewing there in the sun by himself. What annoyed him, what amused him, what in spite of himself impressed him, was to see how the bounder ignored advantages of position. Matthews had forgotten, too, what an imposing individual the bounder really was, and measuring his tall figure, listening to his deep voice, looking at his light eyes and his two sinister scars, and the big shaved dome of a head which he this time uncovered, our cool-enough young man wondered whether there might be something more than fantastic about this navigator of strange waters. It was rather odd, at all events, how he kept bobbing up, and what a power he had of quickening. What? A school-boyish sense of the romantic? Or mere vulgar curiosity? For he suddenly found himself aware, Guy Matthews, that what he knew about his visitor was less than what he desired to know. The visitor made no haste, however, to volunteer any information, nor did he make of Matthews any but the most perfunctory inquiries. "And monsieur, what was his name, your Frenchman?" he continued. "Gaston. He is not my Frenchman, though," replied Matthews. "He went back long ago." "Oh?" uttered Maheen. He declined the refreshments which Abbas at that point produced, even to the cigarette Matthews offered him. He merely glanced at the make. Then he examined, with a flicker of amusement in his eyes, the bare whitewashed room. A runnel of water trickled across it in a stone channel that widened in the center into a shallow pool. "A bit of a lark, eh? I remember that move of yours, Mr. Matthews, to sit steaming, or perhaps I should say dreaming, in a sort of Turkish bath in the bottom of Elam, while over there in Europe." "Is there anything new?" asked Matthews, recognizing his caller's habit of finishing a sentence with a gesture. "Archdukes and that sort of thing don't seem to matter much in Disval. I have even lost track of the date." "I would not have thought an Englishman so dolce far niente," said Maheen. "It is perhaps because we archaeologists feed on dates. I happen to recollect, though, that we first met on the 18th of July, and today, if you would like to know, is Saturday, the 1st of August, 1914. The flicker of amusement in his eyes became something more inscrutable. But there is a telegraph even in Elam, he went on. A little news trickles out of it now and then. Don't you ever catch, perhaps, some echo of the trickle? That's not my idea of a lark, laughed Matthews. Maheen regarded him a moment. Well, he conceded, Europe does take on a new perspective from the point of view of Susa. I see you are a philosopher, sitting amidst the ruins of empires, and wisely preferring the trickle of your fountain to the trickle of the telegraph. If Austria falls to pieces, if Serbia reaches the Adriatic, what is that to us? Nothing but a story that in Elam has been told too often to have any novelty. Eh? Why? Asked Matthews quickly. Is that on already? Maheen looked at him again a moment before answering. Not yet, but why, he added, do you say already? His voice had a curious rumble in the dim stone room. Matthews wondered whether it were because the acoustic properties of a serdab in Disful differ from those of a galley on the Karun, or whether there really were something new about him. Why, it's bound to come sooner or later, isn't it? If it's true that all the way from Nish to Ragusa those chaps speak the same language and belong to the same race, one can hardly blame them for wanting to do what the Italians and the Germans have already done. And, as a philosopher sitting amidst the ruins of empires, wouldn't you say yourself that Austria has bitten off rather more than she can chew? Very likely I should. Maheen took a cigar out of his pocket, snipped off the end with a patent cutter, lighted it, and regarded the smoke with a growing look of amusement. But, he went on, as a philosopher sitting amidst the ruins of empires, I would hardly confine that observation to Austria-Hungary. For instance, I have heard, and his look of amusement verged on a smile, of an island in the Atlantic Ocean not much larger than the land of Elam, an island of rains and fogs whose people, feeling the need of a little more sunlight, perhaps, or of pin money and elbow room, sailed away and conquered for themselves 2 entire continents, as well as a good part of a third. I have also heard that the inhabitants of this island, not content with killing and enslaving so many defenseless fellow creatures, or with picking up any lesser island, cape, or bay that happened to suit their fancy, took it upon themselves to govern several 100 million unwilling individuals of all colors and religions in other parts of the world. And, having thus procured both sunlight and elbow room, those enterprising islanders assumed a virtuous air and pushed the high cries. As our friend Gaston would say, if any of their neighbors ever showed the slightest symptom of following their very successful example. Have you ever heard of such an island? And would you not say, as a philosopher sitting amidst the ruins of empires, that it had also bitten off rather more than it could chew? Matthews, facing the question and the now open smile, felt that he wanted to be cool, but that he did not altogether succeed. I dare say that 200 or 300 years ago we did things we wouldn't do now. Times have changed in all sorts of ways, but we never set out like a Caesar or a Napoleon or a Bismarck to invent an empire. It all came about quite naturally. Anybody else could have done the same, but nobody else thought of it at the time. We simply got there first. Ah? Maheen smiled more broadly. It seems to me that I have heard of another island, not so far from here, which is no more than a pin-point, to be sure, but which happens to be the key of the Persian Gulf. I have also heard that the Portuguese got there first, as you put it. But you crushed Portugal, you crushed Spain, you crushed Holland, you crushed France, or you're meant to, and I must say it looks to me as if you would not mind crushing Germany. Why do you go on building ships, building ships, building ships, always two to Germany's one? Simply that you and your friends can go on eating up Asia and Africa, and perhaps Germany too. Matthews noticed that the elder man ended, at any rate, not quite so coolly as he began. Nonsense! The thing's so simple it isn't worth repeating. We have to have more ships than anybody else because our empire is bigger than anybody else's, and more scattered. As for eating, it strikes me that Germany has done more of that lately than anyone. However, if you know so much about islands, you must also know how we happened to go into India, or Egypt. In the beginning, it was pure accident, and you know very well that if we left them tomorrow, there would be the devil to pay. Do we get a penny out of them? Oh, no, laughed Maheen. You administer them purely on altruistic principles for their own good and that of the world at large, like the oil wells of the Karun. Well, since you put it that way, laughed Matthews in turn, perhaps we do. Maheen shrugged his shoulders. Extraordinary people! Do you really think the rest of the world so stupid? Or is it that the fog of your island has got into your brains? You always talk about truth as if it were a patented British invention, yet no one is less willing to call a spade a spade. Look at Cairo. where you pretend to keep nothing but a council general, but where the ruler of the country can't turn over in bed without his permission. A council general! Look at your novels. Look at what you yourself are saying to me. Matthews lighted a pipe over it. In a way, of course, you are right, he said. But I am not sure that we are altogether wrong. Spades exist, but there's no inherent virtue in talking about them. In fact, it's often better not to mention them at all. There's something very funny about words, you know. They so often turn out to mean more than you expected. At that, Maheen regarded his companion with a new interest. I would not have thought you knew that at your age. But after all, if you will allow me to say so, it is a woman's point of view. A man ought to say things out and stick by them. He is less likely to get into trouble afterward. For example, it would have been not only more honest, but more advantageous for your country if you had openly annexed Egypt in the beginning. Now, where are you? You continually have to explain and to watch very sharply lest some other consul general tell the Khedive to turn over in bed. And since you and the Russians intend to eat up Persia, why on earth don't you do it frankly, instead of trying not to frighten the Persians and talking vaguely about spheres of influence, neutral zones, and what not? I'm afraid the truth is that you're getting old and fat. What? He glanced over his cigar at Matthews, who was regarding the trickle of the water beside them. Those Russians, they are younger, he went on. They have still to be reckoned with, and they aren't so squeamish, either in novels or in life. Look at what they have done in their, quote, sphere, unquote. They have roads, they have Cossacks, they have the Shah under their thumb, and whenever they choose, they shut the Baghdad train against your caravans, yours, with whom they have an understanding, a famous understanding. You don't even understand how to make the most of your own sphere. You have had the Quran in your hands for 300 years, and what have you done with it? Why, in heaven's name, didn't you blast out that rock at ours long ago? Why haven't you made a proper road to Isfahan? Why don't you build the railroad to Koramabad that you are always talking about, and finish it before the Germans get to Baghdad? Ah, if they had been here in your place, you would have seen. It strikes me, retorted Matthews, with less coolness than he had yet shown, that you are here already, from what the father of the swords told me. And he looked straight at the man who had told him that an Englishman couldn't call a spade, but he saw anew how that man could ignore an advantage of position. Maheen returned the look, frankly, humorously, quizzically. Then he said, You remind me By the way, of a question I came to ask you. Would you object to telling me what you are up to here?" "What am I up to?" queried Matthews, in astonishment. The cheek of the bounder was really beyond everything. "What do you mean?" Maheen smiled. "I am not an Englishman. I mean what I say." "No, you're not," Matthews threw back at him. "No Englishman would try to pass himself off for a Brazilian." Maheen smiled again. "Nor would a German jump too hastily at conclusions. If I told you I was from Brazil, I spoke the truth. I was born there, as were many Englishmen I know. That makes them very little less English, and it has perhaps made me more German. Who knows? As a philosopher, sitting which you amidst the ruins of empires, I am at least inclined to believe that we take our mother country more seriously than you do yours. But to return to our point, what are you doing here?" "I'm attending to my business, which seems to me more than you are doing, Mr. Maheen." Matthews noticed, from the reverberation of the room, that his voice must have been unnecessarily loud. He busied himself with the bowl of his pipe. As for Maheen, he got up and began walking to and fro, drawing at his cigar. The red of it showed how much darker the room had been growing. It increased, too, the curious effect of his eyes. They looked like two empty holes in a mask. "Eh? Too bad," sighed the visitor at last. "You disappoint me. Do you know, you are, of course, much younger than I, but you made me hope that you were perhaps, how shall I put it, a spirit of the first class. I hoped that without padding, without rancor, like true philosophers, we might exchange our points of view. However, since it suits you to stand on your dignity, I must say that I am very distinctly attending to my business, and I am obliged to add that it does not help my business, Mr. Matthews, to have you sitting so mysteriously and easeful, and refusing to call on me, but occasionally calling on nomad chiefs. I confess that you don't look to me like a spy. Spies are generally older men than you, more cooked, as Gaston would say, more fluent in languages. It does not seem to me, either, that even an English spy would go about his affairs quite as you have done. Still, I regret to have to repeat that I dislike your idea of a lark. And not only because you upset the nomad chiefs. You upset other people as well. You might even end up by upsetting yourself." "Who the devil are you?" demanded Matthews hotly. "The Emperor of Elam?" "Ha! I see you are acquainted with the excellent Adolphe Gans," laughed Maheen. "No," he went on in another tone. "His viceroy, perhaps, but as I was saying, it does not suit me to have you stopping here. I can see, however, that you have reason to be surprised. possibly annoyed at my telling you so. I am willing to be reasonable about it. How much do you want for the expenses of your going away?" Matthews could hardly believe his ears. He got up in turn. "What in hell do you mean by that?" "I am sorry, Mr. Matthews," answered the other slowly, "that my knowledge of your language does not permit me to make myself clear to you. Perhaps you will understand me better if I quote from yourself. I got here first. Did you ever put your foot into this country until 2 weeks ago? Did your countrymen ever trouble themselves about it, even after Layard showed them the way? No. They expressly left it outside of their famous, quote, sphere, unquote, in that famous neutral zone. And all these centuries it has been lying here in the sun, asleep, forgotten, deserted, lost, given over to nomads and to lions, until I came. I am the first European since Alexander the Great who has seen what it might be. It is not so impossible that I might open again those choked-up canals which once made these burnt plains a paradise. In those mountains I have found what I have found. What right have you to interfere with me, who are only out for a lark? Or what right have your countrymen? They have already, as you so gracefully express it, beaten off so much more than they can chew. The Gulf, the Karun, the oil wells, they are yours. Take them. But Baghdad is ours. If not today, then tomorrow. And if you will exercise that logical process of which your British mind appears to be not altogether destitute, you can hardly help seeing that this part of your famous neutral zone, if not the whole of it, falls into the sphere of Baghdad. You know, too, that we do things more thoroughly than you. Therefore, I must very respectfully, but very firmly, ask you, at your very earliest convenience, to leave Disful. I am quite willing to believe, however, that your interference with my arrangements was accidental, and I dislike to put you to any unnecessary trouble. So I shall be happy to compensate you in marks, tomans, or pounds sterling for any disappointment you may feel in bringing this particular lark to an end. Do you now understand me? How much do you want?" He perceived, Guy Matthews, that his lark had indeed taken an unexpected turn. He was destined, far sooner than he dreamed, to be asked of life, and to answer questions even more direct than this. But until now, life had chosen to confront him with no problem more pressing than one of cricket or hunting. He was therefore troubled by an unwonted confusion of feelings, for he felt that his ordinary vocabulary, made up of such substantives as lark, cheek, and bounder, and the comprehensive adjective rum, fell short of coping with this extraordinary speech. He even felt that he might possibly have answered in a different way, but for that unspeakable offer of money, and the rumble of Mahin's bass in the dark stone room somehow threw a light on the melancholy land without, somehow gave him a dim sense that he did not answer for himself alone, that he answered for the tradition of Layard, and Rawlinson, and Moyer, and Shirley, of Clive and Kitchener, of Drake and Raleigh and Nelson, of all the adventurous young men of that beloved foggy island at which this pseudo-Brazilian jeered. "When I first met you in the river, Mr. Mahin," he said quietly, "I confess I did not realize how much of the spoils of Susa you were carrying away in your chests, and I didn't take your gold anklet as a bribe, though I didn't take you for too much of a gentleman in offering it to me. But all I have to say now is that I shall stay in Disful as long as I please, and that you had better clear out of this house unless you want me to kick you out." "Heroics, eh? You obstinate little fool! I could choke you with one hand." "You'd better try," shouted Matthews. He started in spite of himself when a muffled boom suddenly answered him, jarring even the sunken walls of the room. Then he remembered that voice of the drowsing city, bursting out with the pent-up brew of the day. "Ah!" exclaimed Mahin strangely. "The canon speaks at last. You will hear, beside your fountain, what it has to say, that, at any rate, you will perhaps understand. You and the people of your island." He stopped a moment. "But," he went on, "if some fasting dervish knocks you on the head with his mace, or sticks his knife into your back, don't say I didn't warn you." And the echo of his receding stamp in the corridor drowned for a moment the trickle of the invisible water. End of section 11.